We are beginning. Welcome, everyone. Glad you can make it. Usually we start any class or webinar with a couple of jokes, but this is not the right topic for that. So we're gonna have to figure some other way to to keep this light and interesting. So that might count as a joke. So if it does, excellent. We have a lot of amazing things to cover tonight. I think we're going to take the format a little different than last time. It's going to be more like me interviewing Rabbi Meth and hearing what he has to say about life and end of life issues. But what I would like to start off with, and if you want to handle the admissions right now, sure, is just a little bit of a Torah perspective on the sanctity and the significance of life. So I think a great place to start is to ask ourselves the most fundamental question that really every human being struggles with, asks themselves at some point in their life. They should really probably ask it more often, which is, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? It's a very fundamental question. We all feel like we probably know the answer, but we might need to review it every once in a while. So without further ado, I'm going to put Rabbi Meth on the spot and say, Rabbi Meth, give me your elevator speech. What is the meaning of life?
Football. No.
That was a joke. Now we can start. Go.
Okay. I always, if you come to my classes, I've always reduced the answer to that question into really what Judaism is all about. And I always say, the way I see it at least, Judaism is a very simple religion. It's a very simple religion. I point out the words simple and easy are not synonymous. Those are two different words. You can have something that's simple that's very, very, very hard. So the meaning of life is very simple. The meaning of Judaism is very simple. It's not so easy to do, but it's simple, which is do what's right, avoid what's wrong, is defined by the Torah, so that our neshama, which is ourselves, our neshama, which lives on for eternity, will enjoy the satisfaction of all the choices, the good choices that we've made. We want to avoid having to deal with the consequences of the not such good choices that we've made in the afterlife. And it's really that simple. Do what's right, avoid what's wrong in this world, so that our soul, which lives on in the afterlife, really reaps the benefits of all of our hard work.
Well said, Rabbi Meth.
Thank you.
Well said. Now let's all go do that.
Great.
Okay, that was easy. But in all seriousness, so with that in mind, really we have I want to just investigate one very interesting halacha. Is the rule in the Torah is that any mitzvah in the Torah, with three notable exceptions, but for all practical purposes, every mitzvah in the Torah gets pushed away to save a life. So let's just draw what that looks like. Let's say, for example, someone is about to starve to death or otherwise needs to consume a cheeseburger on Yom Kippur. Is that okay? It's not just okay. It's a commandment. You must. Let's say that cheeseburger doesn't belong to you and you've got to steal it. Yes, you should steal a cheeseburger on Yom Kippur and you should eat it. Let's say you can't get to that cheeseburger. Can you drive a car on Yom Kippur to eat the cheeseburger to save a life? The answer is yes. Let's say you got to steal a car to go steal the cheeseburger to eat it on Yom Kippur. The answer to all of those is yes. And let's explore for a second the reason why. And I think the reason why, if you think about it, is really quite obvious. The purpose of life is to do mitzvahs, to fill our days with richness and spiritual greatness, to come closer to God, to experience that in afterlife, like Rabbi Meth explained. That time that we have, it's worth breaking any mitzvah to preserve that time so that we can fill up with more mitzvahs. And I was reminded of the good old days when I used to be in school and you have a time test. Imagine you have 60 minutes to complete, 40 answers. Every moment of that is so valuable and it's worth, I guess you can't steal to pass your test, but we can understand that that 60-minute test is the perfect mashal, it's the perfect analogy to our lives. Our life is a timed test. We're here to be tested. We're here to grow. We have a limited amount of time to do that. And we have to preserve the time the best we can, even if it means violating a mitzvah. That's the idea of preserving life. The good news is that if you're here right now, for tonight, you passed the test.
I like that metaphor. That's a very good mashal. Thank you.
Excellent. I appreciate that. So without further ado, I want to talk about maybe two difficult stories. That the first one, Meth is going to start with an old friend of ours that happened here in Las Vegas.
Oh, yeah. This was This was a very just like an emotionally powerful story. I learned a lot from it. Those who, if you were here, it was right when I landed. So it was in 2013, right when I moved here to town. And one of our call rabbis is a good friend of mine, a good colleague of mine. I'm actually somewhat related to. Was working here at the call and who is desperately ill. Many of you might remember our dear friend Rabbi Yosef Kalter of blessed memory, and a wonderful person. Meant so much to me, and he was just a remarkable person. And if you recall, he's since passed. And when I moved here, he was struggling with cancer, and the situation was just getting worse and worse and worse. And then I'll never forget, there was one Friday, I don't know, I'm going to say in October, something like that, maybe November, probably more like September, October, somewhere in that zone. And, everything was just crashing and burning. They rushed him to the hospital, and like, we thought that was it. We're going to say our goodbyes. I know if you remember Rabbi Kalter, he had a couple of beautiful little children. And I remember that Friday was harrowing. I'm sure Rabbi Davidowitz, you remember that day very well.
Too well.
It was too well. He was in Summerlin Hospital right here. And it was really, really, really tough. And I remember at one point, the doctors, nurses came in and basically were encouraging and in a respectful, they were doing the best that they could in a very respectful and I would say in an appropriate to some degree way, really encouraging, Rabbi Kalter, his wife, sign a DNR, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and just, hospice and just like, let it be. This is going to be the end. And Rabbi and Mrs. Kalter were going as things were really, really crashing back and forth. And at one point they were almost ready to sign it. And then I remember we had to step out of the room, let them, really talk it over. And they decided, we're not ready to do that just yet. And I remember it was so interesting in retrospect. That was such an important decision because Rabbi Kalter lived another few months, maybe, I don't know, 2-3 months.
I think more than that.
It was more than that?
Yeah, I think so.
It was, he lived, I mean, again, he was terminal. He didn't live that much longer than that. It was just a few months, but it always struck me, maybe those were the few months. His children were very young. I was actually, I don't know if I told you, one of his kids gave me a call yesterday. They're adorable children. They still view Vegas as their home. They're big Knights fans. So they're my friends, but maybe Tzvi Kalter, who's I don't know, he's like 13 right now. Maybe he remembers his dad because of those few months that they were able to extend his life just a little bit more. Now, a person might argue, what was the value of his life? It was the quality of life wasn't all that good. Was there really a point? Well, you know what? It made it very likely, I would guess it made all the difference in the world for his children. And those last few months of his life were tremendously valuable. And we're not even talking about, like what you were talking about earlier about all the mitzvahs that he was able to accomplish, but just the very real human connection that he was able to have with his family for those few months, really shows one side of the issue of why we value and we really do cherish. And I think that's a story we could all relate to.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, is I'm remembering he was still in Vegas then. It was a little bit, maybe probably a month past that. And he was invited to he was a Kohen. So he was invited to be the one who would do the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, which is for a different webinar, how that works. For a child, it's a very rare mitzvah. Even Kohens who live a long life don't have many opportunities to do it. And he wanted to do it. And I drove him there and I was really trying to talk him out of it because he was so weak. And you're going to go into a house, full of people. And he literally was barely able to get in and out of the car. And on the way back, we were driving together and he basically says, like, now do you see that I'm right? Like I had the opportunity to do this mitzvah. That was like, and he was he felt so rich from that. And, that's really what life is about. Getting that one more mitzvah. Our sages teach us that a mitzvah done through pain when it's difficult is 100 times more valuable than a mitzvah done when it's easy. So to have that, what's the value of that? I want to tell you a quick story. That's the flip side of that story. And then I think our Meth is going to give us some sources which are going to help us address really, how we make these judgment calls. And one more thing I want to throw in there, interestingly, is I was less into the nurse's etiquette, to be honest. At that time, I felt like there was a little bit of a pressure there that might have not been appropriate. But also it's interesting to wonder is what's guiding those nurses' decision?
Right.
What value
Right.
system are they tapping into, to advise someone, to sign a DNR, et cetera. So the story goes like this. I got a phone call, very random. I'm not going to say too many details, but someone from Phoenix got my number because they're involved in the kollel there. And they were the next of kin to their cousin who was found by his employer who sent in the police, unconscious on the floor of his condo, 70 years old, otherwise completely healthy, but had some kind of, maybe it was a diabetic incident, that undiagnosed diabetes. He was passed out. And by the time he got to the hospital, he had brain damage. Now, did we know he had brain damage? It's hard to figure out, but the doctor was telling him he had brain damage and he was in really rough shape. And this cousin is coming in from Phoenix and we're talking as she's driving in. And what do I do? What do I do? And the doctor is basically saying, sign a DNR, sign a DNR, sign a DNR, right? No idea what this guy's wishes were. It's state of Nevada. It's going to be her decision, even though she was a cousin and hadn't spoken to him in years. And we'll get to that later. And she was the one who was charged to make the decision. Luckily is she reached out to a rabbi to get some guidance. And the right answer was, do not sign the DNR. About an hour later, the patient, no, it wasn't an hour later. It was about 4 hours later, ends up coding, which means had a heart attack. I think it was 2 or 3 times within a very short period of time. I don't remember exactly, 40 to 60 minutes, something like that, right? At that point, the halacha was, do sign the DNR. Do sign the DNR. Question is, so DNRs, are they good or are they not good? Answer is yes. Rabbi, let's talk some Talmud and let's try to understand.
And maybe to begin with is sort of like the flip of the other end of the pendulum. As Rabbi pointed out, we value in Judaism, the value of life is so precious. I remember I once heard a rabbi once say, if we do value life and the capacity, the opportunity of performing a mitzvah, if we view it as infinite. So always remember, infinity cannot be divided. So even if it's just a short time, a little bit of life where a person can't accomplish all that much, but even, a very small mitzvah is of infinite value. So the time we have on this planet is of infinite value. The flip is, or the other side of the pendulum is, well, does that mean under all circumstances, in every situation, if a person is, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, is suffering excruciating pain, are we obligated at all times to do all medical intervention, no matter what the situation is and no matter what the circumstances? So kind of to get the discussion going is an important story. For those who I included in the email a source packet. We're not going to really look at most of these sources inside. They're just helpful to have for if they come up. But if you have the source 7 on the sheet that the sources that I emailed, it's a story from the Gemara in Ksubis 104a, and I'll just share it outside. Is the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the redactor of the Talmud, the leader of the Jewish people, shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, he was dying. It was the end of his life. He was dying, and the yeshiva, the Beis Medrash, the yeshiva that in town, they saw that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was dying, so they called everyone together and they began to pray, so as to extend Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's life. And they're praying, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is, his life is being extended from the power of this group's prayer, but his disease wasn't getting cured. And it says that his bite, which means, I think that's understood as his maidservant, one of his attendants who is a righteous person, saw that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was suffering greatly. And he really was actively dying. And the prayer was just actually prolonging his death in agony. So she went ahead into the Beis Medrash and broke like a jar or something like that. It says she smashed a jug of some sort, created a loud distraction. Everyone stopped praying to see what was that. They stopped praying. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died. And it's very clear that from most of the sources, she's praised for this. As a matter of fact, it's an interesting conversation, I believe it's the Ron was a classic, one of the classic commentaries says, you see from here that in some situations, it's permissible to pray for someone to die. That doesn't mean you're allowed to kill people. And it doesn't mean you should be praying that your enemy dies. It means in certain medical, someone is suffering tremendously, that was appropriate. So we do see one of the lessons you could take from that story is although, yes, if we can extend life, we want to extend it as much as possible. It does not mean that we're required under all circumstances in every situation to do whatever we can, whenever, wherever, however, to extend life for 10 seconds. Specifically when we're dealing with patients who are actively dying and terminal situations. So the question is what are some of the parameters? And I want to emphasize and then re-emphasize, and then Rabbi, I'm going to emphasize it a third time.
That's an excellent idea.
Thank you. Is that these situations are so case specific, and I don't want anyone walking away. It would be a big mistake if we walk away from saying like, okay, now I understand what to do, in my situation, whether it be for myself or for a loved one. This is just really intended as a very broad overview. If you've never been introduced to some of these ideas, just so we have a broad overview, but medical situations vary so differently. People vary so differently. These do at some point, we'll see, become a very personal decision. And I want to highly, highly underscore, these are case-specific situations. When a situation comes up, it's really, really best practice and good advice. Have someone, specifically a rabbi, who's knowledgeable in these laws. We're literally dealing with life and death. We want to make sure we're not making the wrong decision.
Yeah, I would argue a little bit there. I wouldn't say it's best practice. I would say it's completely necessary.
It's very necessary.
As we're going to see soon, is some of the prohibitions and the sensitivities that we're talking about are very, very high level, halachas, 10 commandments level, murder, things like that. So we really, I'm sorry to use the M word, but we really do have to be very, very sensitive to the nuances. And Meth and I are speaking openly because we're among friends.
Right.
So this is not to issue anyone their certificate if they can advise people end of life, but really just to be sensitive to what the questions are and to be able to ask educated questions.
Speaking of murder, that's really one of the first things to talk about. When we talk about end of life care, if you go to any medical ethicist, bioethicist, I serve on one of the medical ethics committee here, the Summerlin Hospital Network, the Valley Hospital Network. You speak to anybody there, and they will tell you time and time again that when it comes to we're talking about terminally ill, dying patients. So you will hear two words that ethicists will tell you there is no difference between them, and that is withholding care or withdrawing care. Okay, withholding care or withdrawing care, which means if a patient is very, 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 critically ill, and an ethicist without a Torah perspective will say, well, if you have two patients who are identical and they're both in critical condition, let's say they both have the same, underlying, their medical situation is exactly the same. So what difference does it make if we just say, we're going to withhold care. We're not going to initiate some form of treatment to patient A, versus for patient B, let's say patient B already is receiving that treatment. We are going to withdraw that treatment. We're going to take that IV out of the patient. What's the difference? They're the exact same patient. Okay, and we're going to begin here and to some degree, I hear it maybe intuitively why that might make sense, but this is the first and perhaps most important idea when it comes to end of life care, dealing with end of life situations. Number one is to recognize in halacha and Jewish law, that's where all of the difference is going to lie. The difference between withdrawing care and withholding care is black and white. It's night and day. In halacha, you can never, ever, ever withdraw care. And the reason is exactly as Rabbi Davidowitz defined, is one of the 10 commandments. That's lo sirtzach. Thou shalt not kill. There is, if you have on your list, if you see note 4, you don't really need this. Again, I'll tell you, we'll discuss it outside, 4, 5, and 6. The halacha in the Talmud talks about an idea. There's a condition called a goses. Goses does not translate well into English. I would loosely translate it as a actively dying patient. Hard to exactly define. I think famously, there's a great doctor, Rabbi Abraham is his name, asked one of the great sages in Israel, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and Dr. Abraham was the head, I think he still is the head of Shari Tzedek Hospital. And he asked Rabbi Auerbach to define what a goses is. It's a great story. Rabbi Auerbach told Rabbi Dr. Abraham, he said, "You're the doctor, you figure it out. I don't know, I'm just a rabbi." It's a medical condition. He says, if you're in the medical community and you've been around dying patients, when a patient is actively dying. The halacha is a goses cannot be touched. You cannot even touch a goses. You can't even close their eyes. And famously, Sifsei Kohen Shach, this is in source 5, if you have the sheets, says anyone who touches a goses is murdering. It's like you're a murderer. Why? And Shach explains, I believe this is the Talmud, says, what is this comparable to? To a flickering candle. As soon as someone touches it, it immediately goes out. A goses is someone who's terribly fragile because of their end-of-life situation. Judaism, and I think hopefully, I hope most cultures and societies, we do not rate life. I do not say, I am more important than you, or because I've got let's say Mr. A is young, healthy, and his whole life ahead of him. We don't say he's more important than a 97-year-old patient. Judaism does not view that. Again, barring very, very unusual circumstances of scarce resources. That's not what we're talking about. We have one ventilator to save 2 patients. We're not talking, those are hypothetical situations. Putting that aside, life is infinite and life is valuable. And if a patient is still alive, if you do anything that will actively kill that patient, you're a murderer. And a goses is like a candle that's flickering. It's so fragile. If you just touch that candle, it might go out. So the halacha is a goses cannot be touched. And I use that as a way of highlighting when it comes to any kind of end-of-life care, doing anything, any activity, any proactive action, pulling a plug, withdrawing some kind of care, that action, that is considered potentially an act of lo sirtzach, an act of murder. And halacha sees all of the difference in the world. Not doing something, you can passively, you're not a murderer. If there's a patient here, let's say a horrible case. Let's say there's a patient who's rushed into the ER and you can save his life, has a heart attack, and I can defibrillate the patient and bring him back to life. If I choose not to, so what am I? So in halacha, you're not a murderer.
Right, where the ethicists would tell you are.
Right. An ethicist might tell you you're a murderer. You could have saved that person. Judaism says you are not a murderer. Judaism would say what you've done is you violated a grave prohibition of lo samod al dam reacha, don't stand idly by on your brother's blood. There's a mitzvah of healing people, which is of the highest of order, as Rabbi Davidowitz pointed out, but it's not murder. The difference between active and passive involvement makes all the difference in the world. So as a general rule, for any patient, withdrawing care is always going to be a problem. And that's very, very, very important.
Right. And that's also why it's important to, God forbid, at the time that we're making these kind of decisions, it's important to speak to a rabbi in the front end.
Yes.
And the reason is because, a person might say, let me just intubate the patient. Let me just start this type of treatment. And then now we're in a situation where, really we would be in a situation where we could be signing a DNR, but the DNR is not going to help because he does not need to be resuscitated because he's being helped by these machines, etc. Whereas really, maybe it was the will of the patient or the will of the person who's coherent in making the decision is not to get to that state. So it's really important to have these conversations now. And we'll talk about the medical proxies in a bit, and so that we're ready for those things, when they come.
And that's a good example. So for that Rabbi Davidowitz brought up, once a patient is intubated, as a general rule, you'll never extubate, I believe is the word. We'll never remove the trach or whatever it may be once it's in. what might happen is there might be a medical need to remove the trach for other reasons. Then the question is, do I have to reinsert it? And you might have a workaround.
So I just want to interrupt right there. I was actually involved it was about 3 years ago in a situation like that. And again, it was so important that they were talking to a rabbi along the way, is that they did need to, if the word is extubate, sounds like it could be, is if they need to take this tube out for medical reasons. Now the question was, do we put it back in? If you would have called me an half an hour later, he would have got a different answer. So it's really a very important thing.
Another, just as an aside, I don't think we're pretending to be doctors over here. We're using fancy medical terminology, extubate,
like extubate.
But but I think everyone hopefully understands what we're talking about. So that's really important. Lesson number one is. By
the way, in general, if we make any grammar or syntax errors, just throw it up in the chat, and we'll do our best to ignore it.
Well, thank you. Okay, so withdrawing care will never be okay. But what about withholding care? What about do I have to go ahead if a patient is critically ill?
Well, let's maybe first talk about ourselves. Let's
talk about ourselves first. But and maybe we'll talk about what happens if a patient is incapacitated, making choices for other people. We'll deal with that separately in just a moment. But what's the story about withholding care? Is a person required to receive every possible therapy or treatment at all times in all situations? So the general rule is, the idea is there's a responsibility to save people. Again, you can never kill. You can never withdraw treatment, but it's of huge value. Let's say if I'm a physician, to go ahead and help other people. If a patient is really, really catastrophically ill and I can help that, if I could save that patient, I am required, because of the Jewish mandate of pikuach nefesh, of the value of life, of saving life, to do whatever I can to save the patient.
Okay, let me interrupt again. Let me bring that before the but. Let me bring that to myself for a second. So I'm, thank God, a healthy person, right? I hope to be that way for a while. So I'm obligated, just like I'm obligated to save my friend. If God forbid my friend was drowning, I'm obligated to preserve my own life as well. So if I want to say, God forbid, I don't want to eat, I don't want to drink. I'm a healthy guy. I have a strep infection. If I take antibiotics, I'll be fine. If I don't, then I won't be fine, right? Do I need to take those antibiotics?
So the answer is yes, and this is a very important point that Rabbi Davidovitz is bringing up in the United States, and I think it's coming from a good place, but it's somewhat misguided, is the number one rule in medical ethics is patient autonomy. Patient autonomy is the number one criteria. If I don't remember, the four major things in medical ethics are, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and I think justice. I think those are the four things. But patient autonomy is like the holy grail. And Judaism, we'll see, their autonomy is an important point. But as Rabbi Davidovitz pointed out, if a patient gets, gets some kind of infection, it says, I don't want those antibiotics. Right. You are not allowed to make the choice to say, I don't want to take those antibiotics. You have to take those antibiotics. However, there are limitations.
Just to have some fun, just for a second. If I would choose, I don't want to talk about myself. My mother doesn't get mad at me. If Bob, right, he's behind these beautiful banners. If Bob back there would choose not to take those antibiotics and he would die, I want to just get this technical point because we visited this before. He's not a murderer. Again, he's wrong. He withheld care.
Right.
There is that distinction.
He's not a murderer.
Again, an ethicist might say it's the same thing. What's the difference? But from a Torah perspective, murder is going to be pulling the plug. It's going to be, taking that pill, which would kill me. Don't stand by your brother's blood, preserve your own life, says, take care of yourself. If you don't do it, it's bad, it's wrong unequivocally, but it's not murder.
It's not murder. And because of that, there are limitations to how far a person has to go, let's say, to extend his own life. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein basically gives I think helpful for this class, two parameters with an exception. He limits the responsibility that we have to extend our own lives, and by extension, other people's lives as well. And that is number one, if a person is in a situation where they are terminally ill, they have some kind of medical condition that there is no underlying cure for that disease. He defines it as, within 12 months, something that's fairly immediate. There's no way under he says under basically any medical understanding, this person is actively dying, or not actively dying, but is terminal, very terminal. Number one. And number two, the pain is excruciating. If a person is dealing with tremendous pain in a situation where there is no way to cure the underlying disease, so then Rabbi Feinstein argues a person has the right to say, I don't want to preserve my life any farther. I don't want to take a certain treatment that's just going to extend this agony. So again, as Rabbi David, you're not allowed to kill yourself. You're not allowed to actively do something to kill yourself. But the responsibility of going ahead and extending one's life in a situation where there is no way to cure the underlying disease, and it's a terminal disease, and the pain is excruciating by most standards, then a person may, not must, and that's a big difference, a person may say, you know what? Ad Khan, I'm not interested in further treatment. Again, withholding. Withholding. A person could say, so for example, if a person has some kind of, I'm going to give an example, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, and I'm not a physician, so I don't know if anything that I'm saying is accurate. And there is no medical known cure. This person has 3 months to live. And again, if this is a bad example because of, well, we have a physician right there and he's nodding. He agrees. Okay, right. So stage 4, it's that kind of situation. And, they say, maybe if you go some radiation therapy, which is, devastatingly painful, we might be able to buy some time. So that patient has the right to say, I'm not interested in that. We're not curing myself. This, the therapy, it's just excruciating. Let's just, we're going to hold off on that. Let me bring that back quick to the example of my friend who was, well, I never met him, but my friend's friend, who was found in the hotel room, in his condo room, is that situation of a person who's coding, and it's just worse and worse and worse and worse. Every time, I don't want to get too graphic, but we're shocking this guy and bringing it back. At what point is that no longer a favor for the pain that he's going through? Right. And I remember I didn't, make this call myself. I spoke to one of the biggest experts, in America about this. And in his words was at that point, again, going back to what I said before, very case specific. I'm even have trepidation to even share an example, but I do want to put like a human face on this to try to make sure that we understand the concept really well. So don't quote me on this. But at that point, this person is so ill. There's no chance that he's coming back. He's got extensive brain damage, according to doctors. He's been unconscious for days without proper, oxygen and nutrition. That wasn't the first time he coded, right? So at that point, he's not coming back. At that point, you don't need to intervene anymore. Right. You can't unplug him, but you don't need to intervene anymore. And there are two, or let's say there are three exceptions. Well, let me just, before we do the exceptions, I mentioned that a person may choose that I don't want to continue those therapy, to extend, prolong, the process. A person is certainly allowed to, and it's actually considered meritorious to say, I'm going to do everything I can to try to get every minute on this earth. And that's considered a good thing to do. Remember, but it's not a requirement. It's a time test. It's a time test, right? Now there's a person says, I'm okay putting up with excruciating pain and I want to get that extra minute. So maybe I'll be able to wrap tefillin one more time. Maybe I'll be able to study one more thing of Torah. I'm willing to go through that. A person can make that choice, but you're not required to. There are three, the way Rabbi Feinstein, and this seems to be a fairly well accepted, and I don't want to say unanimous, but it seems to be mainstream and accepted, is there are three things that a person cannot even withhold. Again, withdraw, you can never do anything, but your person cannot withhold nutrition, hydration, and oxygen. Now, oxygen, I want to be very clear, does not mean intubation. It means just putting one of those oxygen things to give a person a little bit of air. those things should never be withheld. Feinstein argues that, those things are the types of things if a person is kicking and screaming, he says at a certain point, you shouldn't force feed him or, do it against their will, because he says that act might actually end up killing the patient. But theoretically, oxygen, just like, getting that air on, or a mask, one of those types of things, nutrition and hydration should never be withheld. But all other therapies, in a situation where, again, terminal and excruciatingly painful, a person has in theory the permission to say, this is not what I want.
Right.
Okay.
Good. So maybe let's just take a moment to just everyone, let's take a deep breath and let's put a cap on what we've said. And I think we're pretty much done.
Yeah, and
we're not stay where you are because we have more to talk about
more
tonight.
to talk about.
But I want to just move on, from here
To
to
the
the
next
next piece. So it sounds like overall what we're saying is like this: is that there any type of intervention which is going to shorten someone's life? For example, take. If extubating is a word, it's undecided still. Extubating, if a person pulling the plug, we've always heard those words. That's always going to be a problem. Anyone who is fundamentally healthy, is not critically ill, is going to have an obligation to do whatever it takes to keep their life going, right? If it means taking antibiotics or it means being intubated, no matter, how invasive it is, if you're a fundamentally healthy person, you can't just say, I want out, right? That's our obligation. And that's going to be whether we're deciding that for ourselves or we're the next of kin or the proxy who's deciding that. And then go ahead.
And maybe we should talk about that.
Yeah, I think we should. Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess the cases where that would not apply is if someone is terminally ill, there really is no medical hope for their survival, and now it's a question of prolonging their life, but it's causing them, right, I have to use the words, unbearable pain, excruciating pain, something like that. Then that's a personal decision, and for the person to make. And if the person is not able to make that decision for themselves, for example, they're unconscious or incoherent, then whoever's responsibility it's going to be is going to follow really those same guidelines. That'll be the same idea. So what do we do very practically is, hopefully we'll all be, super healthy till 120, but some of us won't. So practically speaking, how do we prepare for this?
Okay, so, and maybe if I can add, or I think Rabbi, one of the things that you pointed out is a lot of times, actually many of the times, if not most of the times, when a person is critically ill to this extent, they're incapacitated. They're not able to make these decisions. Oftentimes this is the case. And what happens very commonly is it's a family member trying to make a decision for their loved one. What do we do? And we're going to take a moment just to talk about what's called the medical proxy, or let's call it in a broader term, advanced directives, is that maybe there's something that we can do while we're healthy to start thinking about these eventualities and what can we put into place to go ahead and make these decisions in advance. So there are a couple things that we can talk about. Number one is what's called a living will. What a living will is, and again, I'm not an attorney, but a living will is not to be confused with a regular will like an estate will. But a living will is a form of advanced directives where a person goes ahead and lists out, here's what I would like to happen under every single medical eventuality under the sun. If, God forbid, I have this disease, I would like this treatment, but not that treatment. If I have that disease, I would like treatments A, B, C, and D, but not X, Y, and Z. And that's called a living will. I'm not a big fan of them for two reasons. Number one, people change their minds. Right now, a person's happy and healthy, and they put together this whole living will, and I come up with what I would like, if I'm in a horrible situation. Well, maybe when you're in that situation and you actually are in the circumstance, you'll think differently.
One way or the other.
One way or the other, exactly.
Maybe you think you have a high tolerance for pain,
right?
Or maybe, whatever it might be. But yeah, making those decisions before they're actually relevant is pretty rough.
It's very rough. It's people just recognize people change their minds. Number two, it's usually an effort in futility because we can't think of every contingency, go through the list of all 4,000 horrible things that I might die from and the different therapies that I want this or that. It becomes a little ridiculous. I think it's a little unrealistic. So a classic living will, there's not necessarily anything against it, but I don't think it's as vital as some people think. What is more important is what's called a medical proxy, is to recognize when a person becomes incapacitated, what happens. So let's say in the state of Nevada, the law is it follows a certain system of like next of kin. So for example, if a person becomes incapacitated, their spouse makes their decisions. Their children might make the decisions. Every state, they differ slightly, and when those differences come up, it can make major differences, but there is a certain sequence of who gets to make what decisions. The truth of the matter is, halacha also, or Moshe Feinstein also says it's if a person can't make decisions, so the children, brothers, siblings should make those decisions. Now, Rabbi Feinstein, when it comes to halacha, the way Rabbi Feinstein, if I understood him correctly, he argues what you should be doing is not what you want.
Right.
You, the brother, you, the child, but you would try to figure out what would the patient have wanted. So, and that's a very hard thing to do because often we project, well, if I was in this situation, I never would want this, or I always would want that. He says you really try to get in as best as we can, get into their mind. So there's by default, when a patient is incapacitated, there's a certain default who that goes to.
I'm having a very difficult time keeping this serious. I have to apologize.
That's okay. We need to lighten it up. We're
No,
talking
but
about
I'm trying to think of where in the pecking order Moshe Feinstein would say one's mother-in-law would come making those decisions. I personally would suggest it should be pretty low.
Pretty low, yeah.
Pretty low. You definitely want someone who loves you a little more than that.
The problem with just relying on this natural default progression, there are a couple things. Number one, just to be aware of, and there was actually a pretty tragic case. It was a little bit of a different situation, but the principles were exactly the same, is to recognize common law marriages in not all, but in most states will not be honored. So if a person is married, let's say halachically, they did a kiddushin, they did the chuppah, they did the whole thing, but they never actually registered with the state. So I know here in the state of Nevada, that will not be honored. So be very aware of that. Now, is common law marriage a good thing, or what does the Torah say about that? Different conversation, but it is something to be flagged. Number two, or one of the limitations of just kind of following the default is, what if you can't locate those people? Let's say I am, traveling in the middle of nowhere, and God forbid something happens to me, okay, there's a sequence of people. Let's say we can't locate those people. Number three, what if you're not comfortable with those people? Let's say you don't like your kids, you don't like your wife or husband or whatever it may be. It's again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it.
There could be another sensitivity also, is that a person might not want to burden certain people with those kind of decisions.
Sure. So what's a much better idea is to sign what's called a durable medical power of attorney. Sometimes it's called a medical proxy. There are different terms for it, but essentially what you do is they're legal documents. They're very easy to fill out. You fill out this form, and it basically says, in case of any kind of medical condition, I'm incapacitated, I'd like Mr. A to make all medical decisions. If Mr. A isn't available, I'd like it to be Mr. B. If Mr. B isn't available, Mr. C. It lists 4 people. If those 4 people aren't available, it says what to do. So for example, specifically, I included on our email, you got something like this. Now this is mislabeled. I don't know why they call it. Here they call it the halachic medical directive. They call it the living will. It's the Aguda, the Agudath Israel of America put together a form. They call it a living will. It's technically not a living will. It's a medical proxy form. It's very easy to fill out, and you just list who would you like to make decisions: child, a parent, a spouse, and it lists, they should consult a particular rabbi. If that rabbi is not available, a second rabbi, a third rabbi, and then it even has a thing at the end. If those rabbis are unavailable, those organizations are unavailable, it has to be done in accordance with Torah law. I recommend take a moment, fill it out. Officially needs to be signed, notarized. It'll be honored. It will be honored. It will be honored. Hospitals are very happy when you have these things. Hospitals, and just from being on the ethics committee, one of the things they freak out about is patient comes in, they don't know who to call. You have one of these, they're the happiest people in the world.
Well, how does hospital find it?
So what you should do is you get one of these copies and then you give it to everybody. There are organizations that will hold on to it. you give it to your rabbi, you give it to your kids, you give it to a bunch of people, and they'll be able to, if God forbid, in a medical situation, they'll be able to give it to people. And I guess that leads us to a classic, I just want to pick on it as an example, an advanced directive that people always talk about, and that's the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate Order, a DNR. And so what's the story with the DNR? That's a form of advanced directive. People will sign a DNR. Now, what is a DNR? A DNR is a Do Not Resuscitate. And specifically what it does is it prohibits medical personnel from doing two things. Number one is CPR, and number two is a defibrillation. So what's the story with the DNR? So kind of going back to, if we go back to what we've been talking about all day, basically is like this. A person is a healthy, guy living a happy life and says, you know what? CPR looks horrible. It is, which it is. CPR, if you've ever seen CPR, it's horrible. It is, they break bones. It's probably of the most invasive therapies that we have is CPR. The person says, I would never want that. Well, it's not the same for all patients. If you're a healthy person, all of a sudden your person's heart stops, CPR very possibly could bring that person back to life. So a person should not have a DNR just lying around in their house on file, just because I never want to go through that. That's probably not in line with Jewish thinking.
Just randomly, just because this came up, I was on a flight to Kansas City last week. Don't ask why. I'm sitting next to a 38-year-old Iraq veteran who was a pilot. And he told me, about 2 years ago, he had a massive heart attack. Now, this guy looks like slim trim 180. He looks like I think he was like in a Marine or something like that. And I'm like, what happened? And we were talking for quite a while. He basically said, whatever. Saddam Hussein buried a lot of bad things in the desert. And if you hung out in the desert for long enough and the wind was blowing in the right way, you inhaled some of it. And then 6 months later, or 6 years later, depending on what's going on, you don't realize it caused massive cardiac issues. It didn't show up right away because I was otherwise healthy. I was on a 5-mile run, whatever amount of years later. And then boom, had a guy like that had a DNR, his wife and 3 kids never would have seen him again. Now so he'll probably be okay for the rest of his life. He's on certain meds, he's got, therapies, etc., some stents, but he could live. He's a healthy guy. Besides, he could live for a long time. But just a very practical example of why a DNR is dangerous. There's another factor also that we discussed before, is that when you have a DNR, is what do the doctors look at? What do they think when they see you? They're like, we'll work on the next guy. Let's get an early lunch, right? That's not something that is going to help you, maybe when there's a little bit more of a judgment call.
That's a very important point, Rabbi. And that is, are there situations where it's okay for a person to put in a DNR? So the answer would be yes, as we've discussed earlier. DNR is Do Not Resuscitate. That's, in a sense, that's withholding a form of treatment. I don't want CPR done to me. So if, going back to our model earlier, if a person is terminally ill and critically ill and is suffering, and CPR is really very invasive. By the way, oftentimes in those situations, it's probably not medically even warranted. It's probably not going to be helpful. But putting that aside, a person could say in that type of situation, it might be okay to say DNR. I don't want CPR done. But Rabbi, to your point, it's very smart, and I would recommend this. If you as a family have decided, this situation warrants DNR, here's what I would recommend. Fill out the form or whatever it is, DNR. Don't tell the doctors. They don't need to know that, because a lot of times, and I'm not accusing doctors, and doctors
I'll accuse them.
Okay, no, many of them mean well, but everyone has what's called like biases and this and that. And it's very possible and very common, a doctor sees a DNR. If the nurses see a DNR in place on a particular patient, they're not going to be getting necessarily the best of care. Is it like that in all cases? No. Many cases, I don't know, but there's no reason. You have nothing to gain. Right. Keep the DNR in your pocket, and when it's time, you can right. show it, and they'll honor it.
Or again,
they'll be very happy.
You can communicate with this healthcare proxy of yours, and you can say, listen, when if God forbid I'm in that situation where, right. and I'm telling you how I feel, I'm in all this, at that point, give the doctors, sign it then. Give them that direction then. If he codes, don't shock him back. There's no reason why a person can't do that. So that's a much better idea, much safer.
Okay.
So we're up to the 50-minute point. Do we want to get into organ donation now, or do you want to do that for next time?
Whatever you want, I could cover, we could probably do it.
I'm not sure. I don't have any good jokes about organ donation. So, so that could be a problem. I could work on them while you're speaking. I may get one. I'm not sure. This is what I would like to do. I think we should hold off on organ donation for now because we do have the next one coming up.
Okay, we'll cover it in the
And
next class.
let's see if we can do a quick crash course on estate planning.
Okay.
And that's something which is it's a little bit of a lighter thing. It's talking about money instead of life. And maybe we'll start like this. It's very, very simply. Actually, I was speaking to an attorney today who's an estate planning attorney. And I thought a very simple way to just explain to him what the challenge is. The challenge with estate planning is all of us have certain things that we want. We want to get our son to get the Ferrari and our daughter to get the house on the beach, hopefully, right? And whatever it is. And all of that is fine and good and noble, but none of that is recognized by the Torah. The Torah, says very, very clearly that when a person passes, his estate shall be split up in the following way. So if you kind of ignore that mitzvah in the Torah, how legally in America, you'll get what you want, but really you'd be in violation of this law. And and from a Torah perspective, you're making your children into thieves because they're each taking something they're not really supposed to get. So what we need to do is to create a system where you're following the Torah and you're also able to do what you want with your assets. So Rabbi, what do you suggest?
So it's.
I like asking the questions.
Yeah, right. And I certainly am not an expert in this as well, but there are, simply put, the simplest way, there is a legal device that a person can put in place. And really, so you can, as Rabbi Davidowitz sort of pointed out, we want to create an environment, a context where you can have your cake and eat it too. We want to be in compliance with the Torah, but the Torah system of inheritance might not necessarily be in line what I would like to see. So is there a way to have your cake and eat it too? And the answer is it's a pretty straightforward process. It's a document called the Shtar Chatzi Zachar, which is somewhat of an involved technical document, but essentially what you would do is you need to find someone who knows what they're doing. What you do is you have your attorney put out your will exactly how you want. Write your will, trust, however you would do it. You're, non-Jewish. They don't need to know the first thing about Torah. Get your will all written up and all taken care of. You then go to an expert to execute what's called a Shtar Chatzi Zachar. Well, the document of a Chatzi Zachar. Basically, what the document does is it essentially says like this: a second before I die, I want to, donate all my money. I mean, over something, I'm just making a joke. I'm donating all my money to, some ridiculous organizations, whatever it may be. I want my money to be donated in a particularly, unhelpful way a moment before I die. And that's what's going to happen, in which case, and no one walks away happy unless all of my family follows that which I wrote in my will. And if they want to, then I'm hereby undoing my gift.
A gift with a stipulation.
So the technical elements, how exactly that works, what you sign, what you don't sign, is really not so relevant. What the most relevant takeaway is, if a person wants their will to be enforced and not to violate halacha, and look, if you're not concerned that your kids are going to bicker and they'll be like, we'll do it on our own. We're going to volunteer, that's fine. But if a person wants the will to be legally binding, you just need to get one of these Shtar Chatzi Zachars executed. It's painless. It's simple. From what I understand, again, I'm not an expert in it, but it's nothing complicated. It's all boilerplate. Nothing needs to be drafted. And by executing this document, as you're able to do both.
It's basically a rider that goes onto your trust, will, etc.
Exactly.
And again, it's very uncomplicated and gets you out of major halachic issues. So definitely a good idea if anyone needs some help with that, let us know. If you're on this, you probably got an email, reply to it, and we'll either help you get you the document or get you the right person to deal with this. Okay, so what comes after? Not after this class, but what comes after life? That's the question. And I think maybe we're coming towards the deadline, so we're not going to be able to have as much time as this as I would have loved. But one thing to think about that's really interesting is what the Torah perspective on death is in general. So, death, I'll tell you, this is me talking personally. Rabbi Matthew, could let me know if you think this is the Torah's opinion also. I think it is people talk about, a funeral being a celebration of life. I don't love that at all. I think that it's important for people to experience, the deep and very painful emotions of losing, a friend, a colleague, a family member, a spouse, a parent, God forbid, a child. It's important to face those emotions head on, and it's important to cry. My wife's grandfather, blessed memory, used to say in Yiddish, he says, there's three things that you learn from a baby. He said, a baby cries when he's sad, he laughs when he's happy, and he never stops moving. And if we live like that baby, we're going to be emotionally healthy people. Is when we're happy, we should be happy. When we need to cry, we should have the strength to cry and to cry it out. And we never stop moving. No matter what's going on, we got to keep accomplishing and growing. So I believe that a funeral is for crying. We talk about hesped and bechia. It is for crying. But at the same point, there is an understanding, and I don't mean to say this in a platitude type of sense, of they're in a better place. They're not in pain anymore. I don't think that's the right approach either. It's not they're in a better place. They're actually where they were meant to go the entire time. They've taken the next step that their whole life was preparing for. So do we miss them dearly? Absolutely. Is it gut-wrenchingly painful? Absolutely. Do we understand intellectually that they're exactly where they're supposed to be? Is yes. They're now enjoying the benefits of Rabbi Meth's elevator speech that we started with. Is they've done a lot of great things, and now they're enjoying that.
A good example, I've always thought a good metaphor, you send your kid off to college, they're in a great place, they're learning, they're on the next step. If you've ever sent your kid off to college, I've never done this before, but I've sent my kid off to day camp. It's very sad. You miss your child. And it's not a healthy thing to say, to not be in touch with that emotion of I miss my kid, I miss my loved one. But what do you mean? Aren't they in school? Aren't they in camp having a great time? They're where they're supposed to be, but that doesn't mean it's not an emotionally painful. It's interesting. Do you remember this? The Rosh Yeshiva, our head of our yeshiva, I don't think I heard him say this, but I've heard it quoted, in his name. He had a beef with all people with Jackie Kennedy. You ever hear this?
No.
Jackie Kennedy. Apparently, again, I'm an American history guy, but I don't know this, but apparently at JFK's funeral, Jackie stood there bravely, not crying, stoically, and, with all that courage and the Rosh Yeshiva, our rabbi used to say, like, that's so unhealthy. It's like a very like an American thing. Do you remember when George H.W. Bush, his funeral a couple years ago? Do you remember? And it was a beautiful funeral. I mean, the eulogies were very, very powerful. And do you remember George W. Bush, 43? He spoke. In my opinion, he spoke beautifully. And at the end of a 40-minute eulogy, which was beautiful and touching, he as he was saying his final goodbye, he cried for a billionth of a second, and everyone was like, scandal. Like, this is, I'm like,
right.
The dude, he just lost his dad. He was very, very close with his father. Yeah. That's so, in my opinion, not to, place judgment, but I don't think it's healthy. Like, losing a loved one, no matter how old they are and that they lived a healthy life, a full life and happy life, it's hard to say goodbye.
Right.
It's hard
let me
to
just to cut you off, because I like to do that. But this is not going to be a joke though. I want to take that now. We just talked about losing a loved one. Let's talk about ourselves for a second. When we think of the fact that, after 120 years we're not going to be here anymore. The question is, does that make us feel down? And I think it's a very, very deep question. I think the answer needs to be is that, yeah, I kind of like my life. I'm somewhat addicted to this body. I've been with it for a long time, right? I don't want to lose it. I don't want, and Matthew was talking about this, my soul. I am my soul. The I, who I'm talking to you right now, I don't want to leave the life that I have right now because I love it and I feel attached to it. But at the same point, I need to look and say, but this is not the end. This was not the point. It's like the kid, going back to Meth, it's the kid who doesn't want to graduate college. He likes college. It's fun, right? I know, but the whole point of college was to get you to that next step. And I think that when we look at that, death is not a depressing thing that, we're going to live, the next 50, 80, 100 years, being scared of. Rather it's the next step on this journey, and it's really what we're all going for. We're all planning to die eventually, and that it is the next step. It is the plan. It's not a disruption of the plan. That's it.
That's it. Death and taxes.
Don't even start with death and taxes, because this guy who we found in the hotel room, I'm sorry, the condo room, I'm now the executor on his will, and don't ask. And
How do you pull that off?
it's not actually a good thing. It's annoying. I don't think I get paid for it. But long story short is I'm the executor on his will now, and he's got to file 2 more tax returns. I'm like, seriously, the guy's dead, right? But no, the IRS always gets their they get their piece. They get their piece. Okay, listen, friends, thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry that I couldn't keep it serious. I have a very hard time with that. But hopefully we'll see you again. Is it next week?
I think so.
Whenever it says in the flyer, that's when we're going to see you again.
That's when it will be.
Please bring your friends. Let us know if they want to come, and we'd love to have their email
Or we'd be able to
addresses.
field questions if anyone wants.
Oh, we'd love to field some questions, right?
Okay,
Matt's
so I
doing a
guess
great job.
officially the class is over for all those who want to bounce out. If anyone has, any questions.